Marcus Thompson stepped off the red double-decker bus onto the busy streets of London with a confidence that made other tourists look twice. He was not like the usual visitors who came to see Buckingham Palace. While they carried guidebooks and wore comfortable walking shoes, Marcus carried an expensive camera around his neck and had the look of someone who believed rules were meant to be bent. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the October wind, and his leather jacket gave him an air of rebellion that stood out against the more conservative dress of other sightseers. At 32 years old, Marcus had built a reputation as a travel blogger who did not just visit places but challenged them. His social media accounts were filled with stories of him questioning tour guides, arguing with security personnel, and pushing boundaries that most people respected without question. His followers loved him for it. They called him brave and authentic. They said he showed them the real truth behind tourist attractions that tried to control visitors with unnecessary rules and fake authority. Marcus had grown up in a small town, in Ohio, where his father worked at a factory and his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. From an early age, he had watched how people with money and status treated those without it. He remembered his mother coming home tired and upset after being spoken to rudely by her employers. He remembered his father losing his job not because he was bad at it, but because the factory owners decided to move operations to another country where they could pay workers less. These experiences had shaped Marcus into someone who did not automatically respect authority. He believed that most people in positions of power were just ordinary people who had been given fancy titles and uniforms. He thought that if you challenged them directly and confidently, you could expose the fact that their authority was mostly an illusion designed to control regular people. This attitude had served him well in his blogging career. He had confronted rude hotel managers and gotten free upgrades. He had argued with airline staff about baggage fees and won. He had questioned museum security about photography rules and gotten permission to take pictures in areas where it was normally forbidden. Each success made him more confident that his approach was correct. As Marcus walked toward Buckingham Palace, he pulled out his phone and started a live stream for his followers. "Good morning, everyone," he said into the camera with his trademark, confident smile. "Today, we are going to expose one of the biggest tourist traps in London. Everyone thinks these royal guards are so powerful and important, but I am going to show you that they are just regular guys in funny costumes who rely on people being too scared to challenge them." The comments on his live stream immediately started flowing in. His followers were excited to see what he would do. They encouraged him to be bold and not let anyone push him around. Some shared their own stories of being intimidated by authority figures, and Marcus felt validated in his mission to stand up for ordinary people against what he saw as fake displays of power. Marcus had done his research before coming to London. He had read about the history of the royal guards and learned that they were real soldiers, not just ceremonial figures. But this information only strengthened his belief that their authority was overblown. In his mind, being a soldier in modern, peaceful England was not much different from being a security guard at a shopping mall. He thought they relied on their fancy uniforms and the weight of tradition to make people think they were more important than they really were. As he approached the palace gates, Marcus could see the guards in their iconic red uniforms and tall, black hats. They stood perfectly still, their faces showing no expression as hundreds of tourists gathered around them taking pictures. Marcus watched other visitors behaving respectfully, staying behind the barriers and speaking in hushed tones, as if they were in a church. This behavior annoyed him. He believed these people were being manipulated by an outdated system that wanted them to feel small and powerless. Marcus began walking closer to the guards than the other tourists. He noticed that there were rope barriers and signs indicating where visitors should stand, but he saw these as suggestions rather than rules. After all, he reasoned, this was supposed to be a public place funded by taxpayer money. Why should ordinary people be kept at a distance from public employees who were ultimately working for them? The first guard he approached was a tall man who looked to be in his 20s. His red uniform was perfectly pressed, and his black boots were polished to a mirror shine. His bearskin hat added at least a foot to his height, making him look imposing and intimidating. But Marcus was not intimidated. He saw past the costume to what he believed was just another young man who had been trained to stand still and look serious. Marcus positioned himself directly in front of the guard, closer than any other tourist dared to go. He held up his phone to record the encounter and began speaking loudly enough for his live stream audience to hear. "Here we have one of the famous royal guards," he announced. "Everyone acts like these guys are so special, but look at him. He cannot even move or speak. What kind of power is that? Real authority does not need to hide behind silly traditions and fancy dress-up clothes." The guard remained motionless, his eyes focused straight ahead, as he had been trained to do. His lack of response only encouraged Marcus, who interpreted the silence as proof that the guard had no real authority to back up his intimidating appearance. Marcus began to feel the familiar rush he got when he successfully challenged someone in a position of power. His followers in the livestream chat were cheering him on, telling him to get even closer and see what would happen. Other tourists began to notice the scene Marcus was creating. Some looked uncomfortable and moved away, not wanting to be associated with someone who was clearly breaking the unwritten rules of respectful behavior around the guards. Others pulled out their own phones to record what was happening, sensing that they might be witnessing something dramatic. Marcus felt energized by the attention. This was exactly what he lived for. The moment when he could expose what he saw as the fake authority that kept ordinary people in line. He was convinced that he was about to prove once again that confident people who refused to be intimidated could overcome any system designed to make them feel powerless. What he did not realize was that he was about to learn a very different lesson about the nature of real power and the consequences of mistaking respect for weakness. Marcus could feel the energy building around him as more tourists stopped to watch what he was doing. His live stream viewer count was climbing rapidly, and the comments were flowing faster than he could read them. Most of his followers were encouraging him to push further, to prove that these guards had no real power over a confident American citizen who knew his rights. The validation from his audience made Marcus feel invincible. He decided to test the limits even more dramatically. Marcus stepped over the rope barrier that was meant to keep tourists at a safe distance from the guards. The moment his foot crossed that line, he felt a thrill of rebellion surge through him. He was now in territory that other visitors respected, as off-limits, but Marcus saw it as public space that belonged to everyone. After all, he reasoned, his tax dollars as a tourist were helping support this whole operation. The guard in front of him remained perfectly still, but Marcus noticed something different in his eyes. There was a subtle shift, a heightened alertness that had not been there before. But Marcus misinterpreted this change. He thought the guard was becoming nervous because his authority was being challenged by someone who refused to be intimidated. In reality, the guard was following his training, assessing the situation and preparing to respond if the tourist continued to escalate his behavior. "Look at this, everyone," Marcus said loudly into his phone camera, making sure his live stream audience could hear every word. "I am standing right next to this guard and he cannot do anything about it. All that ceremony and tradition is just for show. These guys are basically just human statues put here to impress tourists who do not know any better. The real power is with us, the people who pay for all of this with our money." Other tourists began to gather in a larger circle around Marcus and the guard. Some looked fascinated by his boldness, while others appeared uncomfortable with his behavior. A few older British visitors shook their heads in disapproval and muttered comments about disrespectful Americans. But Marcus was too focused on his performance to notice the growing tension in the crowd. Marcus decided to make his point even more dramatically. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small American flag that he had brought specifically for this moment. He began waving it near the guard's face, trying to get some kind of reaction. "When you come to America," he announced to his camera, "our security guards do not stand around in silly costumes pretending to be more important than they are. This whole thing is just theater designed to make people think the royal family deserves special treatment." The guard's training was being tested, but he remained motionless. However, Marcus failed to notice that other guards positioned around the palace had begun to take note of the disturbance. They were communicating with each other through subtle signals and radio communications that tourists could not see or hear. The security system at Buckingham Palace was much more sophisticated than Marcus realized, and his behavior was being monitored and assessed by multiple layers of protection. Marcus grew bolder, As the guard continued to remain still, he began to circle around him, narrating his actions for his live stream audience like a nature documentary host studying an exotic animal. "Notice how he cannot even turn his head to follow my movement," Marcus said with growing confidence. "This proves that all of this royal guard mystique is completely fake. They are trained to stand still and look impressive, but they have no real authority to stop someone who refuses to be intimidated." The comments on his live stream were becoming more excited and encouraging. Some viewers were suggesting that he try to touch the guard's uniform or hat to see what would happen. Others were daring him to try to make the guard speak or laugh. Marcus felt like he was gaining momentum and proving his point about the artificial nature of royal authority. What Marcus did not understand was that the guards were not powerless or purely ceremonial. They were active duty soldiers from elite regiments of the British Army, trained not only in ceremonial duties but also in combat and security operations. Their stillness was not a sign of weakness but a demonstration of extraordinary discipline and professionalism. They were capable of transitioning from ceremonial mode to active security response in seconds if the situation required it. Marcus decided to escalate his demonstration even further. He began to speak directly to the guard, asking him questions and demanding responses. "What is your real name?" he asked loudly. "How much do they pay you to stand here and play dress-up? Do you actually believe you are protecting anything important? Or do you know this is all just a tourist show?" When the guard did not respond, Marcus interpreted this as further proof that the man had no real authority or power. The crowd around Marcus was growing larger and more restless. Some tourists were taking pictures and videos of his performance, while others were looking around nervously for security personnel to intervene. A few families with children moved away from the scene, sensing that the situation was becoming unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Marcus was so focused on his interaction with the guard that he failed to notice the subtle changes happening around him. Additional palace security personnel had appeared at various points around the area, though they were not yet intervening directly. Radio communications were increasing, and there was a general heightening of alertness among all the palace staff who could see what was happening. The live stream comments were becoming more intense, with some viewers urging Marcus to be careful, while others pushed him to be even more provocative. The viewer count had climbed to several thousand, and Marcus could see that his video was being shared rapidly across social media platforms. This attention made him feel like he was accomplishing something important, exposing what he saw as the fake nature of royal authority for the world to see. Marcus began to feel like he was on the verge of a major breakthrough. He was convinced that he was about to prove conclusively that the power and authority of the royal guards was nothing more than an elaborate bluff designed to keep ordinary people in their place. He had no idea that he was actually approaching a line that, once crossed, would trigger responses that would completely change his understanding of the situation he had created. The guard remained perfectly still, but trained observers would have noticed the slight adjustments in his posture and the increased alertness in his eyes. The moment was building toward something that would surprise everyone watching, especially Marcus, who was about to learn that there was a significant difference between ceremonial duties and actual powerlessness. His confidence was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. Marcus felt the momentum building as his live stream audience grew to over 5,000 viewers. The excitement in the comments was infectious, and he could see his follower count climbing in real time. This was exactly the kind of viral moment that had made his career, and he was determined to push it to its ultimate conclusion. He believed he was on the verge of exposing one of the world's most famous displays of authority as nothing more than elaborate theater. The crowd of tourists around him had grown substantially. Some were clearly uncomfortable with his behavior and kept glancing around nervously, looking for security personnel to intervene. Others seemed fascinated by his boldness and were recording everything on their phones. A group of teenage tourists from Germany were laughing and encouraging him, while an elderly British couple looked absolutely scandalized by what they were witnessing. Marcus decided it was time for his most dramatic move yet. He approached the guard until he was standing directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the individual threads in the red fabric of his uniform. The guard's face remained completely expressionless, but Marcus was so focused on proving his point that he failed to notice the subtle tension in the man's shoulders and the way his eyes had become even more alert and focused. "You know what I think," Marcus announced loudly to his camera and the gathered crowd. "I think these guards are not even real soldiers. I think they are just actors hired to stand here and look impressive for tourists. Real military personnel would not allow someone like me to get this close without doing something about it. This proves that the whole thing is fake." What Marcus did not realize was that his behavior was being carefully monitored and recorded by multiple security systems. Palace security had been tracking his movements from the moment he crossed the rope barrier, and they had already identified him as a potential threat. His live stream was being monitored, his identity was being verified through facial recognition systems, and security personnel were positioning themselves strategically around the area. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad and pen. "I am going to leave my contact information with this guard," he announced to his audience. "When he gets off work tonight, maybe he can call me and explain why he thinks standing still in a funny costume makes him more important than regular people." He began writing his name and phone number on a piece of paper, planning to stick it in the guard's uniform or equipment. The moment Marcus moved to touch the guard's uniform, everything changed. The guard's training kicked in immediately. In one swift motion, he stepped back, raised his rifle to a defensive position, and shouted in a voice that echoed across the entire palace courtyard, "Stand back. Do not touch the guard. Move away immediately." Thurber. Transformation was so sudden and dramatic that Marcus stumbled backward in shock. The man who had been standing perfectly still like a statue had instantly become an alert, commanding military presence. His voice carried absolute authority, and every person in the crowd immediately understood that this was not a performance or ceremony. This was a real soldier giving a real order. Marcus felt his confidence drain away as he looked up at the guard, who now seemed much taller and more imposing than before. The rifle in his hands was clearly real, and the man holding it was obviously trained to use it. For the first time since arriving at the palace, Marcus began to understand that he might have seriously misjudged the situation. But his live stream was still running, and thousands of people were watching. Marcus felt trapped between his fear of the guard and his need to maintain his image as someone who could not be intimidated by authority. He tried to recover his composure and speak to his camera, but his voice was noticeably less confident than before. "See what I mean?" he said, though his words sounded forced and unconvincing. "The moment someone challenges their authority, they have to resort to threats and intimidation. This just proves that their power is not real. They cannot handle being questioned by someone who knows their rights." However, Marcus's analysis was completely wrong. The guard had not acted out of weakness or desperation. He had followed his training precisely, escalating his response appropriately when a potential threat had attempted to make physical contact. This was not about intimidation or fake authority. This was about real security protocols designed to protect one of the most important buildings in Britain. Within seconds of the guard's shout, additional security personnel began appearing from various directions. They moved with the smooth efficiency of professionals who had trained for exactly this type of situation. Marcus suddenly found himself surrounded by men and women in different uniforms, some obvious palace guards and others who appeared to be plainclothes security officers. A senior security officer approached Marcus with calm authority. "Sir, you need to stop filming immediately and come with us for questioning. You have violated several security protocols and your behavior is being treated as a potential threat to palace security. Please surrender your phone and follow our instructions." Marcus looked around and realized that his situation had changed completely. The crowd of tourists had backed away significantly, creating a wide circle around him and the security personnel. Some were still filming, but they were keeping their distance. The mood had shifted from entertainment to serious concern. This was no longer an amusing confrontation between a bold tourist and a ceremonial guard. This had become a real security incident. Marcus tried to maintain his defiant attitude, but it was becoming increasingly difficult as more security personnel continued to arrive. "Sir, I am an American citizen and I have rights," he declared, though his voice was shaking slightly. "I was not doing anything illegal. I was just exercising my freedom of speech and freedom of the press." You cannot arrest me for asking questions and filming in a public place." The senior security officer remained professional but firm. "Sir, this is not a public place in the way you understand it. This is a secure government facility with specific rules and regulations. You have been warned multiple times to maintain appropriate distance from the guards, and you chose to ignore those warnings. You then attempted to make physical contact with security personnel, which constitutes a serious breach of protocol." Marcus looked at his phone and saw that his live stream was still running. His viewer count had climbed to over 8,000 people, and the comments were flowing rapidly. Some viewers were telling him to run, others were advising him to cooperate, and many were expressing shock at how quickly the situation had escalated. Marcus realized that his attempt to expose fake authority had instead revealed that the authority was very real indeed. The security officer extended his hand toward Marcus. "Your phone, sir. The live stream needs to end now, and we need to secure all recordings of this incident. You can cooperate voluntarily, or we can compel your cooperation. The choice is yours, but the outcome will be the same either way." Marcus looked around at the circle of security personnel surrounding him and realized that his confidence had been completely misplaced. These were not actors or ceremonial figures. They were real professionals with real authority, and he was about to learn exactly what that meant. Marcus stood frozen in the middle of the circle of security personnel, his phone still clutched in his trembling hand. The live stream was still broadcasting to over 10,000 viewers now, but the confident blogger who had started this confrontation was nowhere to be seen. In his place stood a confused and frightened tourist who was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. The senior security officer waited patiently for Marcus to comply with his request to surrender the phone. When Marcus hesitated, looking desperately around for some way to escape the situation, 2 additional officers moved closer to him. Their movements were calm and professional, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of their intent. Marcus finally realized that he had no choice. With shaking hands, he ended the live stream and handed over his phone to the security officer. The moment the stream cut off, he felt completely alone for the first time since the confrontation began. Without his audience cheering him on and validating his actions, he was just one person surrounded by trained security professionals who were treating him as a genuine threat. "You need to understand," Marcus said desperately, trying to explain himself to the officers surrounding him. "I am a journalist. I was just trying to show my audience how these ceremonies work. I was not trying to hurt anyone or cause any real problems. This is all just a big misunderstanding." The security officer who had taken his phone looked at him with the kind of patient expression that professionals use when dealing with people who do not understand the gravity of their situation. "Sir," he said calmly, "journalism does not give you the right to ignore security protocols or attempt to make physical contact with our personnel. You were warned multiple times to maintain appropriate distance, and you chose to escalate your behavior instead of complying with those warnings." Marcus felt panic beginning to set in as he realized that his usual tactics of arguing and demanding his rights were not working. These officers were not impressed by his confidence or intimidated by his claims about freedom of the press. They were simply doing their job, which was to neutralize what they had identified as a security threat. 2 officers moved to either side of Marcus and gently but firmly took hold of his arms. "Sir, you are being detained for questioning regarding potential security violations. You have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to contact the American embassy if you wish. However, you will be coming with us for processing regardless of whether you choose to cooperate." As they began to escort him away from the crowd of tourists, Marcus caught sight of the guard who had been the target of his confrontation. The man had returned to his ceremonial position, standing perfectly still with his rifle at his side. But now Marcus could see something in the guard's eyes that he had missed before. It was not fear or uncertainty. It was the calm confidence of a professional who had handled the situation exactly as he had been trained to do. The crowd of tourists parted as Marcus was led through them toward a side entrance to the palace. Some were still filming the scene, while others looked on with a mixture of fascination and horror. Marcus could hear whispered conversations in multiple languages as people discussed what they had just witnessed. He realized that his attempt to expose what he thought was fake authority had instead become a public demonstration of very real consequences. As they walked, Marcus tried to engage the officers in conversation, hoping to convince them that he was not a real threat. "Look," he said, "I know this looks bad, but I was just trying to make a point about how people in authority positions use intimidation to control regular citizens. I never intended to actually hurt anyone or cause any real security problems." One of the officers escorting him responded without breaking stride, "Sir, your intentions are not the primary concern here. Your actions crossed multiple security boundaries, and those actions have consequences regardless of what you intended to accomplish. The security of this facility and our personnel is not something we can compromise based on someone's stated intentions." Marcus was led through a series of corridors and security checkpoints that tourists never saw. The palace was clearly much more than the ceremonial building he had assumed it to be. There were sophisticated security systems, multiple layers of protection, and dozens of personnel who were all part of a comprehensive security operation. Marcus began to understand that he had not been challenging a few guards in funny costumes. He had been challenging an entire institutional security apparatus. They eventually arrived at a small windowless room with a table and several chairs. Marcus was seated at the table while the officers took positions around the room. The senior security officer who had initially confronted him sat across from him and opened a folder containing what appeared to be photographs and documents. "Mr. Thompson," the officer began, and Marcus was shocked to hear his own name. "We know who you are. We know about your blog, and we have been monitoring your live stream since you arrived at the palace this morning. This was not a spontaneous incident. You came here with a plan to create content by challenging our security procedures." Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that his entire confrontation had been observed and recorded by palace security from the very beginning. They had not been caught off guard by his behavior. They had been allowing him to escalate the situation while documenting everything he did. His attempt to expose their procedures had instead provided them with extensive evidence of his security violations. The officer continued, "We have recordings of you stating your intention to prove that our guards have no real authority. We have video of you deliberately crossing security barriers despite multiple warnings. We have documentation of your attempt to make physical contact with our personnel. And we have evidence that you broadcast all of this to thousands of viewers, potentially encouraging others to engage in similar behavior." Marcus tried to interrupt, but the officer held up his hand to stop him. "This is not a discussion, Mr. Thompson. This is an explanation of why you are being charged with multiple violations of the Official Secrets Act, breach of security protocols, and potential incitement to public disorder. Your status as an American citizen does not exempt you from British law when you choose to violate that law on British soil." The reality of his situation finally began to sink in completely. Marcus was not dealing with ceremonial guards who were all show and no substance. He was dealing with a sophisticated security operation that had been one step ahead of him from the moment he arrived. His confidence had blinded him to the fact that real security professionals do not reveal their capabilities until they need to use them. The officer closed the folder and looked directly at Marcus. "You wanted to test our authority, Mr. Thompson. Now you are going to experience exactly how real that authority is. The consequences of your actions will be much more serious than anything you experienced in your previous confrontations with hotel managers and airline staff." Marcus sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that his entire worldview about authority and power had been completely wrong. Marcus spent the next 6 hours in the windowless room at Buckingham Palace, going through the most humbling experience of his life. Officer after officer came to question him about his actions, his motivations, and his understanding of British law. Each conversation made it clear that his situation was far more serious than he had initially realized. What he had thought was a clever publicity stunt had become a genuine legal crisis that could affect the rest of his life. The American embassy was contacted, and a consular officer arrived to explain Marcus's rights under British law. The embassy official was professional but clearly frustrated with Marcus's behavior. This is not the first time we have had to deal with American citizens who thought they could ignore local laws and customs, the official explained. However, your case is particularly serious because you violated security protocols at one of Britain's most sensitive locations while broadcasting your actions to thousands of people. Marcus tried to explain his perspective to anyone who would listen. He told them about his background, about watching his parents be mistreated by people in authority, about his mission to expose what he saw as fake displays of power. But every person he spoke to responded with the same message. His personal experiences and beliefs did not give him the right to violate security laws or endanger public safety. The most difficult conversation came when a senior palace official arrived to explain the full scope of the charges Marcus was facing. "Sir," the official began, "you need to understand that what you did today was not just a breach of tourist etiquette. You violated multiple serious laws designed to protect national security. The guards you challenged are not ceremonial figures. They are active duty soldiers responsible for protecting the royal family and one of the most important government buildings in the country." Marcus felt sick as the official continued. "Your live stream was watched by thousands of people, including some who we have identified as having expressed interest in attacking government facilities. By demonstrating how to approach our guards and showing what you believed were weaknesses in our security, you potentially provided valuable intelligence to people with harmful intentions. This makes your actions a matter of national security, not just public disorder." The weight of what he had done finally began to sink in completely. Marcus had not just embarrassed himself or broken some minor rules. He had potentially compromised the security of one of the most important locations in Britain. His attempt to prove that authority was fake had instead demonstrated that some authority exists for very real and very serious reasons. After hours of questioning and legal procedures, Marcus was finally told about the resolution of his case. The palace official returned with a thick folder of documents and a very serious expression. "Mr. Thompson, you are being charged with breach of the Official Secrets Act, violation of security protocols, and potential incitement to public disorder. However, given your cooperation today and the fact that this appears to be a case of extreme poor judgment, rather than malicious intent, we are prepared to offer you a plea agreement." The terms of the agreement were harsh, but could have been much worse. Marcus would plead guilty to all charges, pay a substantial fine equivalent to $15,000, and accept a permanent ban from all royal properties in the United Kingdom. Additionally, he would be required to issue a public apology acknowledging that his actions were wrong and potentially dangerous, and he would be prohibited from discussing the security procedures he had observed during his detention. Marcus realized he had no choice but to accept the agreement. The alternative was a lengthy court case that he would almost certainly lose, followed by much more severe penalties including possible jail time and a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. He signed the documents with a shaking hand, officially admitting that his understanding of authority and power had been completely wrong. The most devastating part of the whole experience came when Marcus was finally released and allowed to check his phone. His live stream had been shared across social media platforms, but not in the way he had hoped. Instead of being celebrated as someone who had exposed fake authority, he had become a cautionary tale about American tourists behaving badly abroad. The comments on his social media accounts were overwhelmingly negative, with people calling him entitled, disrespectful, and stupid. Many of his former followers had abandoned his accounts, and several sponsors had already canceled their agreements with him. The viral moment he had created had indeed changed his life, but in exactly the opposite way he had intended. Instead of boosting his career, it had potentially destroyed it. Marcus spent his last night in London in a cheap hotel near the airport, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about the guard he had confronted who had remained professional and controlled even when Marcus was being deliberately provocative. He thought about the security officers who had treated him fairly despite his behavior. He thought about all the warnings he had ignored and all the signs he had misinterpreted. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus began to question the beliefs that had shaped his approach to authority and power. He realized that his experiences growing up had taught him to distrust authority, but they had not taught him to distinguish between abuse of power and legitimate exercise of responsibility. The royal guards were not like the employers who had mistreated his mother or the factory owners who had fired his father. They were professionals doing an important job that required respect and cooperation from the public. On the flight back to America, Marcus wrote the public apology that was required as part of his plea agreement. It was the most difficult thing he had ever written, because it meant admitting that his entire worldview had been flawed. He acknowledged that his actions had been disrespectful and potentially dangerous. He admitted that the guards he had challenged were real soldiers doing real work to protect public safety. He apologized to everyone who had been affected by his behavior. When Marcus returned to Ohio, he found that his story had made national news in America as well. He was invited to appear on several talk shows, but instead of celebrating his confrontation with authority, the hosts wanted to discuss the consequences of his actions and what other travelers could learn from his mistakes. Marcus found himself in the strange position of warning other people not to follow his example. The experience changed Marcus in ways he had not expected. He continued blogging, but his approach became much more thoughtful and respectful. He wrote about the importance of understanding local laws and customs when traveling. He discussed the difference between questioning authority appropriately and simply being disruptive for attention. Most importantly, he learned that real confidence comes not from challenging every rule you encounter, but from understanding when rules exist for good reasons and deserve to be respected. Marcus never returned to London, and he never forgot the lesson he learned at Buckingham Palace about the difference between fake authority and real responsibility.